You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel and Katya Barch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs. All right, we are back and we're here for a fun conversational episode on to practice or not to practice during your period, during your menses. I think it's a really great topic, and there's so many great things to chat on this. So I hope we'll get to a bunch of different aspects of this, looking at why you should or shouldn't, where it comes from, important things to keep in mind in a yoga practice, and then also looking a bit at the TCM perspective or traditional Chinese medicine perspective of what's important during your period, especially as it relates to any physical activity, but definitely yoga as well.
And I think this is a topic really well suited to a podcast because, at least for me, it's not a conversation I've ever had in person. It's not something that comes up in classes. Teachers who are educated along those lines tend to say something like, if you're on your moon time, then feel free to modify. But there's very rarely more information given than that. And because I wasn't educated that way, or maybe because I started practicing before I was menstruating, I always kind of wondered what the background was and was a little bit like, well, why wouldn't you? But it's not a question you can then kind of pipe up and ask during class. So I'm looking forward to diving in.
I think it's an area too, we kind of, I don't know if this is the right word, but almost shame. There's some shame with our periods, even though for me, our period represents fertility and our capacity to bring life into this world. And as someone now in their 40s, I'm ready to be done with it now. I don't want to have any more children. So there's also shame around the menopause phase too that I think is unwarranted, because there's a lot around that. Maybe we'll unpack on another episode, but there's beauty and vitality and fertility implied within this time. It's something we don't talk a lot about, especially in public. I mean, like what you said, we often will call it the moon phase, just it kind of sounds a little nicer,
I guess,
glosses it over, but it's a real thing, and it's part of our physiology, and it's something that I think is
happens
really
pretty
discussing.
regularly. Might as well talk
and
about
it's a great like poop, which we don't like to talk about either. It's one of the few ways we get a really good glimpse into what's happening in our body. So it's like, it's not fun to talk about those things, but they give us a really great view of what's happening inside. So
yeah, I love that. I hadn't thought of it through that lens, but I totally agree. And I'm glad you brought out the kind of the embarrassment or the shame or the sort of secretive side of it, because I think that is something that many females are sort of indoctrinated into. Like, we kind of club together to help each other hide the fact that we're menstruating. When you take a step back and look at it and go, how weird is that? You don't do that with many other bodily processes, do you? Like breathing or eating or, sneezing. It's just something that happens that we've cloaked with all kinds of other things.
The intense fear of having blood on your clothes as a child too, like when you first get your period, of like wearing the wrong clothes. It kind of continues throughout.
And I remember actually having this conversation with somebody where I was like, what's the big deal? It's not even actually blood. And they were like, that's the problem right there. Because it's not even normal blood.
But like, my husband came home from fishing last night and he had blood everywhere. He had cut his finger and it just would not stop bleeding. And it was like a artifact of pride for him,
totally.
Like to us, it's
manly.
Like, depending on where the blood is, it's either prideful or shameful. Like, have it in the right place.
Big tick, wrong place, big cross. Yeah, it's funny.
You have it on your hand. Yes,
dissecting culture always makes you kind of look at things and go, "Why is that? That's odd." So maybe we start with Where did this
Yeah.
even come from? Because it was not something talked about in the yoga practices that I started off with. Maybe not just to me because I was a kid, but I didn't even hear moon times mentioned that I recall. So, as far as you know, where did the directive to not practice during menstruation begin?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not a history expert. I think you have to get really know your lane. So I'll just say this with the caveat of like, I'm not a history expert, but especially as it relates to anything, including yoga. But my understanding and of it really is that it comes more from Hinduism. And well, let's if we back way up, we see that originally, like a long time ago, women weren't even practicing yoga.
Mm,
And so yoga was often mostly happening in the temples back then. And, obviously that's changed a lot over the years. And so when women were finally allowed to practice yoga in the temples, there was this and again, in my understanding, it's a Hinduism, it's something from Hinduism that women aren't supposed to go into the temples during their periods. So it really has nothing to do with our physiology. However, I think if you look it up, I've heard a lot of different interpretations of
mhm,
why in Hinduism women aren't allowed in the temples. Some of it seems more negative or more positive or more energetic.
mm.
There's a lot of variances on that. However, traditionally women in are not allowed in a Hindu temple while they're menstruating. So really it comes from that.
Right. It's that simple.
Yeah. And
Huh.
we've kind of hung to it. And I feel like it's kind of evolved into what we think of as more of a physiological thing or
Mm,
something that we should be avoiding for our own health, whether that's physical, physiological, or energetic,
energetic. Yeah.
that we've really kind of like pushed the brakes on females practicing yoga
You
during
know,
their menses. Yeah.
when I think about the sort of the subliminal messages that I've received around this topic, it is that kind of blend of it reverses the natural flow. It's kind of the opposite direction from the way things are going, or it's depleting something when you're already in a depleted state. And there's this kind of mixture of physical and suggested physiological that I've never really seen passed out into. It could
Right.
stop your period or it could give you endometriosis. So do you know what I mean? There are just all of these kind
I
of
love
vague
that. And
suggestions.
I love and I feel like we should go through all of those and just kind of look at the different reasons. But first off, the other thing I think that's really interesting is just that how long is also really variable. Some yoga
Yeah.
practices are like just the first few days, some are 6 days or until you're completely done spotting or
Hmm.
bleeding. And so there is variance in that as well. But I do think it's important to start with the caveat that like it really is more of a Hindu tradition than necessarily a physiological or fitness. I mean, because yoga is a form of movement. We know that it's much more than
Hmm.
that. But it's not just a yoga thing per se. I mean, obviously, there is separation and overlap between the two. But yeah, it's interesting. So let's start with depleting energy. I mean, I think for a lot of women, this is an easy one. A lot of women are depleted during their periods. There is a loss of vital substances, from the body. And for some women, that's really significant. They have heavier flow, others have lighter flow. And it doesn't necessarily, like, lighter flow doesn't necessarily mean you're less depleted than a
Mm,
heavier flow. It really is different from person to person. But, I think there is a natural rhythm to listening to your body. For some females, they feel much better when they do exercise, and we'll get to why that is in a bit. But for
mm.
some females, they feel awful exercising. They can't motivate themselves to do that, and so yeah, the energy level is a little lower during this period. I think we need to respect that and appreciate that and follow that a little bit. However,
I was waiting because there's always more to it when we talk at yoga
there's
medicine.
more to it, which
Yeah.
we'll fill in. So I think the other one is inversions,
Mm.
right? That's
That's
kind
the
of
big
a
one
big
that
one.
comes up, isn't it? Reversing the natural flow, shifting our orientation to gravity and then more energetically that we want this kind of downward toward the earth, kind of grounding, allowing things to release flow. And when we go upside down, we're tipping that all into reverse.
Well, I think it's twofold. One is there's no concrete evidence that doing inversions while you're on your period will cause a lot of the fear is causing endometriosis, like the
Mm,
blood will flow backward and cause endometriosis, and there's no evidence that that is actually happening. So I think the first thing is, for me, that erases the fear.
mm,
However, we know energetically that this is a downward flow. We and I'm going to talk a little bit more as to why when we talk about the TCM, but there is an energetic downward current that I think is important to facilitate. So for me, it's just not a time when I'm going to be doing lots of held inversions and repeated inversions. But I mean, even downward facing dog is an inversion, right? Like my pelvis is above my heart.
mm.
So I'm am getting that inversion effect, dolphin, So you could be really afraid of a lot of poses, and hence why I think a lot of females just don't practice during their period.
Yeah, that kind of
Oh,
brings
go
up the
ahead.
second point that I think people often use in the context of inversions. The one being that you're going upside down, you're reversing the natural direction at that time, which is down and out. And the second is that these are poses that require some exertion that comes back to that first one of it's going to deplete your energy further. And that's why I'm glad that you mentioned more restorative inversions, like even legs up the wall with your hips slightly elevated is in theory an inversion, but in practice it might give you quite a different feeling in terms of restoring energy and reversing sense of depletion.
Yeah. And I think it really is about getting the pelvis above the heart, is the
Hmm.
idea of kind of facilitating that opposite movement of the downward current that we want. And you can imagine that's just going to be more exaggerated when the hips are straight up and down over the head
Hmm.
and
Yeah,
headstand
and much
versus
more
legs up the
gentle.
wall with a block under your sacrum.
Hmm.
And so you'd get to decide what you want to focus on. And in our female health training, we talk a lot about the details of certain situations where you may or may want not want to be more or less sensitive to that. However, physiologically, I don't need to be afraid of it.
Yeah,
There's a
great.
lot we don't know about endometriosis. We still don't understand. And from a Western concept, we don't understand most of it, which is why I really love the TCM lens, because it really
Mm.
brilliantly makes sense of it, and why I love teaching our female health training, because it makes sense of what we don't really understand. But in endometriosis, there is no correlation yet that we know
Mm.
of. But for me, again, I think at yoga medicine, we love to blend both research and science, which takes a
Mm.
lot of time and a lot of money, with energetic understandings and other Eastern models of the body together to really support all the dimensions of our being. And so I think supporting this downward flow is important. I just don't need to be afraid of being a down dog for a few seconds. Or, if you're a teacher, maybe you hop up into headstand for, maybe you don't hop, but you go up in a headstand to show something for a couple of seconds.
Hmm.
It's not gonna. You don't need to be afraid. You don't need to be worried. Maybe you want to avoid it. I think there's ways to avoid it when you're a teacher. You don't have to demo things, but
Mm.
again, I just want to take the fear out of it, which I think is really important. There's
Yes.
so many different theories about what it does floating around, I think, on the
Mm.
internet, none of which
And I
are
saw some
supported.
that were pretty opposite to each other, like some people saying it's going to stop the flow of blood, and others saying it's going to make the flow of blood much heavier and more depleting. And either way, I feel like probably not super helpful because again, it's not specific. And that's why
Well,
I liked
and
you
I
saying just take fear off the table and focus on
yes.
facilitating the process.
And I think it can. Like, I've been sometimes where I've done some inversions during my period, and for me it has kind of like slowed things down before they started back up.
Mm.
It kind of like had a little momentary kind of like slowing down, and ended up being a little longer because of that. Again, I it was, a time when I did more inversions. I forget why, I don't really remember, but that can happen. And
Mm.
for some people, it can make it temporarily heavier, like a little surge too. So, I mean,
Mm.
everyone's just different. So I think those are all valid points, and I would listen to your body and what
Yeah.
feels most helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing that I see cautioned is strong kind of twists and abdominal compressions. And because there's already kind of contraction and cramping in this area, that you don't want to add to that with any more activity. And I thought that one was really interesting because I don't really do inversions anyway. So that one doesn't come up for me in the context of menstruation. But I love compressing and then stretching my lower abdomen when I'm having my period, or especially when I have period cramps. For me, that is really helpful. So I found this one interesting, and I wondered if you'd come across it as well.
Yeah. Again, I think it's really a personal preference.
Hmm.
And I am the same. I think I find that having some of the compression and twisting feels really good and facilitates it. And maybe we should get in the TCM now because I feel like it's going to make more sense of these things. But um for some people who have more cramping and spasming, it can trigger some of that. So
Hmm.
again, it's kind of figuring out what works for you. But for me, the bigger thing is backing off the twist. It's like I'm not trying to go deep into my twist and doing a lot of core work and
Hmm.
compression to get deeper, but really using it as a way to facilitate blood flow, which is so
Hmm.
important when we look at the menstrual cycle. What we're looking at is in the lining of the endometrium, what we're actually seeing is that the blood vessels will actually constrict, constrict, and then there's a lack of blood flow, so that the tissues start to die actually, and then the blood vessels pop up underneath it, and that's what pushes the endometrium out and breaks it
Mm.
down.
Mm.
And so blood flow and circulation locally in the pelvis is really helpful to facilitate that, because we really want to be able to shed the entire lining, because it sets us up for a more orderly cycle and layering of the endometrium and flow of the hormones. It kind of sets up the whole rest of the cycle. So I think of it
Mm.
like, imagine you had a whiteboard, maybe you were like writing on it the previous day, and then you come back to like show someone something and write on it, and you don't erase what was already there. You just go and start writing on top of it. The period is basically like going and clearing the whiteboard
Mm.
so that it's preparing us to have a more orderly layering of the endometrium and a more orderly facilitating the flow. There's such a perfect timing of events that has to happen through the flow of the cycle, and it allows everything to move a little bit more smoothly and clears out the hormone receptors as well. So it's
Mm. I'm glad
really
that you
important. It's
mentioned
an
this.
important time. Yeah.
I will link in the show notes to the previous podcast episode that you did with Katya, the research roundup on female hormones, because I
Yes.
think it doesn't matter how well you think you understand things in physiology. I find as soon as you dive into the detail, there's always something that you're like, oh, I didn't realize, or I hadn't put those two things together, or I hadn't thought about it that way. And that episode's great to walk you through all of the stages of the female hormone cycle
Yeah.
to kind of pick apart what's going on there. And something that you said in that podcast that I loved that you just alluded to now was to think of it not as something unclean, but in fact as a clean start, as clearing the slate, as a fresh beginning. And I
Hmm.
loved that analogy to think about, how do I want to support this process so that I'm setting myself up for the best moving forward? How do I want to make that fresh start as good as possible?
Hmm. And I think for this reason, anything that encourages blood circulation through the pelvis is going to be helpful.
Mm.
So again, the twisting and compression and MFR can be really great if someone enjoys it. If someone hates it, I'm not going to torture them, right? So I can find other things to do. But those techniques can be really great because they're not really draining. They don't take a
Mm.
lot of energy. A lot of people enjoy it. Not everyone. For people who have a lot of cramping or spasming, they may or may not enjoy it. I find
Mm.
it kind of just depends on the person. And so even like sometimes I really like using Kapalabhati with people, which is traditionally contraindicated. But rather than doing it and really contracting the abdomen, it's almost like the abdomen is kind of flapping back and forth as a
Mhm.
way to provide some local circulation, rather than muscular contraction and vigorous engagement, which, there's a lot of different ways to do everything, but really kind of letting it be relaxed and kind of flapping back and
Yes.
forth, if that feels
Yes.
good to people, to help
I love
stir up
that.
some circulation there.
Yeah, I think the two really important things that I've heard you talk about so far, the sort of recurrent themes, one would be it depends hugely on the individual, how you feel, what you like, what you respond to. And the second thing being intention is so potent. It's not this pose is out, this pose is out, this pose is in, but can you bring the intention of encouraging blood flow and nurturing that turnover of blood vessels and creating this fresh start? And if you do feel depleted, replenishing your energy, and that might be exactly the same set of poses or sequence of poses, but done in a way that creates that feeling in you. Maybe you linger a little longer in some places and less time in others. Maybe you do that Kapalabhati a little more slowly and softly and with that more passive intention. Purpose changes everything.
Yeah, and I think in a Chinese medicine lens too, what we're looking at during this phase of the cycle is moving qi and blood.
Mhm.
And in our Chinese medicine training, we teach our teachers how to really individually analyze the person they're working with. So if the person I'm working with is really deficient or depleted, again, a great time to lay low and find ways to induce circulation without having to expend a lot of energy, which
Mm.
could be myofascial release. It could be a little bit of self massage. It could be pigeon as a way to kind of compress and then release, and shavasana, kind of pumping blood through there. There's so many different ways. We talked about so many of them in the female health training, but really just anything that'll stir up circulation. I mean, some people even just if you wanna go for a walk, just
Mhm.
finding a way to stay active and keep blood flowing even just throughout the body, but definitely if you can through the pelvis, little pelvic cat and cows, maybe on your
Mhm.
back, or, myofascial balls low in the pelvis there, can be really important so that if someone is more depleted, and traditionally people who are more depleted tend to feel worse after their periods or toward the end of their period, because again I'm
Mhm.
losing blood, I'm losing precious fluids, and so that kind of usually exacerbates their depletion. And um, for females who feel a lot worse before their period, this is in TCM and Chinese medicine more associated with stagnation, PMS
Mhm.
symptoms, pain, and even painful periods, like especially those first couple days, and especially with endometriosis. This is really associated with stagnation in Chinese medicine. So trying to move in any way you like, we can be really specific in the female health training, or you can be less specific and just find ways to move, but especially that week before your period and then through the period somehow in a way that
Mhm.
is, accessible to you, to keep that and really facilitate that shedding. It's a great time to detox during your period,
Mm.
whatever whatever that means to you. It's a nice safe time too for females trying to get pregnant to do detoxes as well during their period. So it's a nice time to facilitate that letting go physically, energetically, emotionally,
Mm.
start fresh.
And maybe that is the reason why the other thing that I've seen suggested as something to avoid are bandhas, because I guess the idea behind bandhas is to kind of not necessarily just to regulate, but to hold and seal in energy. Whereas this time is about allowing that energy to leave, to depart, sort of facilitating that shedding. So, is that your understanding of why bandhas might be suggested as something to avoid during menses?
Yeah, and I agree, and I do think we're kinda tiptoeing into the subtle here too. Again,
Hmm.
not something you need to be fearful of, but if you're trying to support this downward, cleansing energy, I think anything that's lifting upwards, whether that's inversions or really lifting the pelvic floor, although I will say sometimes, again, a nice way to create circulation is just a little bit of pulsing of the pelvic floor, again, with, like, this sense of ease rather than contraction,
Yeah.
as a way to stir up local circulation. For some females that's helpful.
Hmm.
I would definitely avoid using a lot of bundle locks to like facilitate that upward energy, and just really focusing on downward cleansing, releasing, circulating, all of those things to help facilitate both the energetic and physiological functions.
Mm, I love it. I feel like there are a lot of ways that you could take that depending on what your individual experience is of your period. So it could be that if you are the kind of person who starts seeking the couch and Netflix, you can't bear to move, maybe that is a super simple restorative practice that gives you that feeling of restoring and replenishing energy, some really gentle work that facilitates circulation. It could be like a restorative fairly gentle twist or side bend, or something that focuses on, as you said, like pigeon, gentle compression of the front of the pelvis, followed by something spacious that allows that region to release. Or maybe you are wanting a little bit more activity and it's a walk around the block, or it's a laid back flow practice where you're not trying to go to your fullest extent of every pose, but you're thinking about moving energy and blood flow through and out of you, and kind of creating that facilitating the shedding process rather than trying to hold things tight or hold things in. Breath work
Yeah.
was something else that you mentioned, is something you could do really gently and subtly, is that kind of rhythmic ebb and flow. So I love that. Lots of places to take it. Myofascial release,
And
you name it.
And I think there's a lot to learn. I mean, obviously we've got a lot of information in the female health course and you can really dig into details there.
Mm.
However, if you're a student or you're just looking to experiment, like just experiment, and there is a lot of individuality, finding what feels helpful. The hard thing with it is that we just get 30 days to get a glimpse of each part of the cycle. So it
Mhm.
can be a very long research project to see how
A
things
lifelong
influence
research
you.
project, in fact,
Well,
pretty
not
much.
lifelong, but,
Nearly.
maybe till you're 50 or so.
Reproductive lifelong.
Yes. Well, yes. And sometimes it's immediate, like how you feel if you have cramps or symptoms during your period. And sometimes it's also that facilitation of the flow of the cycle afterwards too. Like I
Mm.
mentioned, that ability to clear out the lining. And there's so many details to talk about. Like there's so many nuances beyond the scope of this podcast that, give us an eye into who this person is and how they might respond to these practices and what things might be more helpful, looking at, the flow of their period, the consistency of their period, the regularity, their symptoms. I mean, there's so many different things to look at, that just is interesting. I think with females, it's interesting because we get to see more of what's going on
Mm.
within their body. Men are a little more hidden. But yeah, I mean, I say experiment and
Mm.
take away the fear, but also find ways to create circulation. If you don't enjoy moving while you're on your period, that could be maybe just going for a walk. That could be some myofascial release, which for a lot of females, not everyone, but for a lot of females is really helpful during their period. And in a lot of clients I work with endometriosis tend to, not all, I would say about half and half, tend to really like, they either love it or they hate it, the
Yeah.
MFR. So then we find other techniques. And then these kind of like compression techniques, where basically, like, I mean, even lying on your back and taking a knee into chest, like wind relieving pose, and then releasing can be a way to pump and create some changes in pressure and circulation there. Staying
Mhm.
in pigeon, maybe with a roll in the groin to help add a little more compression. You're not going to feel a lot if you're sitting upright, of course. You'll still have some, but and then again, maybe low lunge or shavasana or
Mm.
something. Sometimes even like hopping, just silly things like jumping jacks, malasana,
Mhm.
horse. All of these can help create circulation. And then again, just kind of mixing it in with a little bit of that downward flow. So I like to do little hops, like from down dog with the hips low, kind of hopping around the hands like a malasana. So there is a little
Okay.
downward energy on the hop rather
Mhm.
than the upward energy of like a handstand where you're lifting your pelvis.
I love that.
And again, I usually tend to avoid inversions for the most part, but kind of like really like free and easy, staying away from things that are tensing or gripping. It's not a time when we're usually looking to build a lot of strength. And
Mhm.
so we're really just trying to move stagnation and keep things flowing and healthy and create a fresh start.
I love that. And I feel like there are two kind of general themes that have come out. The first one is generally through the course of your period, a wide range of things that you can do to facilitate the process and to set yourself up with a really fresh start for the beginning of the new cycle. And then the undercurrent of when you are experiencing cramps, or if you are experiencing cramps, some things that might be helpful to soften the effect of those or to alleviate those or to make you feel just more comfortable with the process. And again, really varies by individual depending on whether adding pressure feels good or adding pressure feels bad, or whether moving feels good or whether moving feels bad.
Yeah. And, I think really it is like finding what you like, but
Hmm.
like we started the podcast with, it's kind of like peeling away. We often have this like filter on our vision of like expecting that we shouldn't move. So do a little research and if you hate moving, you don't have to torture yourself, but try it out. Try
Mm.
some movement. It doesn't even have to be yoga. It could be, walking or hiking or running or whatever you enjoy, and try adding a little bit more in during your period and see how your body responds. If you feel more
Hmm.
depleted during or after, you probably need to take it down a notch and find a way to create circulation with less energy expenditure. If you
Right.
feel better afterwards, even just once, sometimes it takes, doing it a whole cycle or two to really feel a change, especially if there's significant changes like endometriosis.
Hmm.
But if you're feeling better afterwards, that's a good sign to keep it. Sometimes we just have to push ourselves, right? Like a lot of us, it's more of just this expectation and lethargy that sets in that's associated mentally with it. And once
Hmm.
we do it, we actually feel better. For others, it's not so much. They actually do feel more depleted. So,
Mm.
it's really listening, and TCM and Chinese medicine that relates more to kind of our constitution and what's underlying it. And it's a great reminder too, if you're feeling really depleted, that you might want to continue some support throughout the cycle too.
Mm.
Restorative postures, yin postures, meditation can be more nourishing versus like the conditioning classes we have, the more
Hmm.
moving, the more vigorous practices, which are great for building yang and moving qi and blood, but can be more depleting if you are really depleted, at least through a TCM lens.
And if you're the kind of
So,
person for whom movement is off the table, even if it's just for, the worst day of your period or the
yeah.
worst couple of days of your period, any kind of themes that you might suggest in meditation where you can have the same internal
Mm,
intention without necessarily having to summon up the energy to move your body?
I love that. Yeah. Well, one, it can be really easy, like MFR or the supine twist or gentle stuff like that.
Hmm.
Um, However, yeah, I think within a meditation, again, visualizing that softening, opening, releasing,
Hmm.
cleansing, you can visualize that downward flow. There's, I think, a lot of different ways you could go, and just even regulating stress. We know that stress in the nervous system, like every other part of the body, does have
Yeah.
an effect on the endocrine system and the hormones. And so, again, those are usually more long-term strategies that you would do throughout the cycle and over a few months, probably before you'd feel a big change in like period pain or something like that for most
Mm.
people. But those are also things to try and are great with meditation.
And one of the things that comes up in the female health training is, it's not about looking at each section of the cycle in isolation, but as you said, developing this more long term view that taking the right actions and holding the right intentions at each phase can really influence our experience of the next phase too. So, any kind of
Yeah.
quick tips that you'd give for the week or so prior to menstruation to kind of set yourself up for the process to be a little more comfortable?
Yes. I mean, definitely for people who are having PMS or
Hmm.
pain, more of those stagnation symptoms in a Chinese medicine lens, staying really active as much as you can. Like I
Hmm.
would be most focused on staying active that week or two, even before the period, because that's really when we're starting to keep things moving from a TCM phase and will really facilitate. And again, it's for people, especially with endometriosis and long standing pain, it may not change the first time you do this. It might take a few cycles and kind of change slowly over time, but just experimenting with it, especially if you're having pain or PMS symptoms, how can you be really active and keep the blood moving globally throughout the body? And that
Yeah.
could be yoga, that could be fitness realm, that could be anything, walking, running, really anything you like, but definitely in a yoga scenario, doing your more vigorous, more active practices in general
Hmm.
during that, at least the week prior, if not two. And then there's people who have both, who have, PMS, menstrual pain, maybe also feel tired afterwards. So for that, I would be really cautious of being really active before the period. Again, within reason for that person, right?
Mhm.
And then also finding nourishing postures to do throughout the cycle. So maybe a restorative pose or two that you do every day, or a meditation practice that you do every day to help support both sides of that equation. So
Mm.
symptoms pre-period or during the period are usually more excess stagnation. So usually respond better to circulation and movement and activity during that phase and prior to it. And
Mhm.
symptoms that get worse after are usually more depletion. And so more restorative postures, usually again, all cycle long. So
That's
that's an
great. I think
overview. Of
that's
course,
really helpful.
there's a lot of individuality. I just want to put that caveat in there. There's a lot of specificity in Chinese medicine, and I'm really simplifying it quite a bit to give students and people new to this information some things they can go and chew on right away. But
Mhm.
just know that there's a lot more to it. There's a lot more individual specificity that we can work with, and postures that we can be really specific to in a therapeutic practice to support female health. And the details of that are just kind of far beyond this quick
As usual,
conversation.
getting into in one short conversation. I love that
But I
though,
love that
because
because the podcast is like for us to give tidbits for people
yeah.
to go and use, and it gives you
Mhm.
so much. Like maybe you don't ever need any more, but if you do want more, then it's there. But if not, just go and experiment. And
Yeah.
that's a lot of information to play with. You could spend a few years just working with that.
Totally. I mean, you've created this sense for me at least that the cycle it's like a window through which we can get to know ourselves in a really particular and specific way. Why not harness that opportunity for self-study to get curious about what helps, what doesn't help, what we feel like we need, what we respond to best. And I love the
Right.
even that the simplicity of the lens of am I experiencing more symptoms before and during? Am I experiencing more symptoms afterwards? What direction does that send me for exploration to see whether it's
Mm.
helpful or not helpful? Yeah, I love
And
it.
that's all symptoms, not just reproductive symptoms, but like headaches, energy
Hmm.
level, like any symptoms that you're having regularly can be a great thing to check into. And, hopefully too, this conversation just changes the lens you see your period through to,
Mm.
really relishing and appreciating this, even if you're like me and you're not trying to get pregnant, there's a beauty to this time. There's a vibrance to
Even
this
more
time.
so. I'm stoked every
Reminding
time
us.
because it means I'm not pregnant.
Yes,
Hooray.
yes, yes. But also it reminds us of our vitality and our capacity, I think, that's really beautiful
Mm.
instead of being like, ooh, this is this awful thing. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of negative symptoms for a lot of females associated with it. And there you go. There's some things you can play with. There's
Yeah.
always more to look at in this journey to health, and maybe other health practitioners to check in with, or acupuncturists, or
Mm.
naturopaths, or, osteopaths, or functional medicine doctors. There's so many different lenses to look at. So, if you're struggling with symptoms associated with your cycle, keep looking.
Mhm.
There's so much out there. As someone who's been in the holistic health field for 20 some years, it's like there's just so many different avenues, and it's just a matter of finding the thing that works for you.
Mhm.
um you know like I love castor oil packs for females who have um stagnation and endometriosis, and menstrual pain is a really nice one you can Google. But there's a million things like that that can be helpful little home remedies that you can do, as well as doctors you can check in with. There's always other resources to try. So hopefully this gives you some inspiration to keep researching and
Mm.
um, experimenting, and using your yoga practice as a way to support that discovery as well.
Yeah. But one question that just came up for me then when I was thinking about how every time I have my period, I'm happy because I don't want and have never wanted to get pregnant. But I know you've worked with a lot of people who are on a journey of fertility and trying to get
Yeah.
pregnant. Any suggestions you'd give for people in that phase where the coming of the period is a sign that it hasn't happened
Sad.
yet? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Yeah, I was just having some conversations about this too. I love working with fertility with with others, which is kind of funny since I've never chosen to have kids of my own.
That's
I got to
okay.
inherit
You
children.
can
That was
spread it
great.
around with other
Check the
people.
box.
Yeah.
But I do love helping people with fertility, because it's such a beautiful thing, and it is such an emotionally sensitive process to go through, especially for females who have been through it several times or for years. It's such a sensitive thing. And, my only thing I can say is because it is a much longer discussion, I think,
Yeah.
is to remember too that the period, as sad of a time as it can be for females trying to get pregnant, is also again that time of preparation for the next cycle. So again, it's a safe time to take herbs or foods or things that you want to do to detox, and really kind of focusing on clearing the slate to set yourself up for a healthier cycle next phase.
Yeah.
And
Let yourself
the
let
process
go
continues.
and get ready to move on. I love that.
Yeah,
So,
it's
how
a
would
tough
you kind
one.
of wrap it up? What takeaways would you give people who've kind of been listening to the conversation? And I mean, there's a huge variety of things we've suggested. Maybe that's one of the big takeaways is do some research with your own body.
Eliminate fear,
Hmm.
experiment, appreciate the beauty of the system, whether it's working properly, perfectly or not, like
Hmm.
whether that's struggling with fertility or endometriosis or PMS or whatever that might be, remembering that there's still a lot that's going right.
Hmm.
Like even fertility patients that I work with, it's like there's usually maybe there's one thing they've found, but there's a lot of things that they're going perfectly.
Hmm.
All it takes is one thing, but like appreciating that there is this system that's trying to come back to health, and it just needs a little bit of support and experimentation to find what's most helpful for your unique body. And there's not a one
Hmm.
size fits all, even in yoga, right? Like even in a
Hmm.
very specific conversation like the period. So finding what's helpful. And if you're not sure, we have a huge resource of yoga medicine teachers. So if you go to yogamedicine.com, click on find a teacher, you can put in your postal code and you can find someone near you. It'll even show you what trainings they've done. So you can see if they've done the female health training with us, which would, if that's what you're working with, would be obviously very helpful.
Hmm.
And then if you can't find someone near you, we've got a lot of teachers who do online sessions as well. So you could find someone who does online sessions who's done the female health one. So yeah, there's plenty of resources, or you can just use all this information to experiment.
Yeah. And if you're somebody who doesn't have any really specific issues that you're trying to address, but you're just curious at what a practice might
Mm.
look like to support your period, any classes on yoga medicine online that you'd send them to?
Yeah, well, we have a few. I have one specifically to support the menses where it goes through some specific techniques, compression techniques, and
Mhm.
techniques to facilitate circulation and release downward flow during the menses. And then I know there's a few others, I think,
I have
as well. I think you
one
have
from
one.
Ali Gear. I think I would recommend that's called eliminating stagnation yoga for your period, which is exactly around that theme of getting things moving. My live stream on yoga medicine online, unfortunately, often coincides with the most miserable day of my period. So you'll quite often see classes there that I'm teaching for me that are also hopefully helpful for you. So I have one called Move Your Midline, which I did on a menstrual crampy day that was exactly how I would support myself when I'm feeling a bit miserable with my period.
I love
Pretty
that.
gentle and laid back, no ambition, no agenda, but lots of rhythmic movement around the torso, gentle twists, gentle side bends. And I have another one, a mellow floor mobility flow that if I had a day where I was like, ugh, I don't even really want to stand up in my practice. This is the kind of thing that I would turn to get everything moving and to generate circulation, but to kind of make that bargain with myself of I'm not even going to stand up. I'm just going to stay on the floor.
Right. And I know I have a whole like PMS playlist, so
Yeah,
that's a really great resource
you've got a
to
whole
for that
women's
kind
health
of.
series that I think I would send people to get the whole sort of the whole picture of the cycle, as
I know
opposed to just
I
jumping
feel
in and
like
taking one piece.
I'm losing track now because we have so
So
many.
many
I think I
playlists.
have like 400 classes on there now. Um, but yeah, there's definitely, I think, a PMS playlist and a women's
Hmm.
health playlist. To find those, I think we'll add it to the podcast
Yeah,
notes, the
we'll link
episode
to the
notes.
show notes to
But
get you a nice easy start for that search.
However, if you just want to find it, if you're familiar with the platform, if you go to my page on yogamedicine.com and scroll down to the playlist, you'll find a PMS playlist. What else is there? Did you say there was, a fertility and IVF support playlist?
Mm-hmm.
So there's practices for PMS, which would be done, and usually it's all in the descriptions, which would be done before the period, that week or two before. There's a period practice. There's a whole series of classes to support. Yeah. So lots of resources there. And then keep in mind, you don't have to just do those focus on the menses. If you understand the concepts for this podcast, like
Mm-hmm.
if there's an inversion in class, maybe skip it and do malasana or a twist or something that feels good, or, maybe trying a slightly more active class during your period instead of, opting to just do nothing and notice. Like there's a lot of different practices that I think can be really good for stirring up circulation that aren't specifically for the period on there. So
Yeah. And I
yes.
say this so many times, but it's so true. One of the things I love the most about online practice is it's so easy for you to personalize the practice. Anytime the teacher is suggesting something that doesn't quite fit for the state that you're in today, you've got privacy. You're in your own space to
I
to
know.
do your modification or your alternative, or to do it in a way that is, less intense or more gentle, or to hit fast forward or to hit pause and stay longer somewhere that feels really helpful. So it really does kind of
I
set you up for that personalization of your practice.
I totally agree. And also in the sense that you can pick and choose the classes that suit
Yeah.
your needs for that day too. The obvious one, right?
Yes.
Whereas, in a group class one, you might be less inclined to strongly modify something, besides just little hand or arm variations or whatnot,
Mhm.
to do a totally different pose than the rest of the class. And, you won't really get to, well, you can choose. You can still choose the intensity level of the class you go to usually. But yeah, I just love online classes now because it can be so specific. That's one thing I
Yeah.
love about our platform is,
Mhm.
we have so many specific therapeutic practices and so many general therapeutic classes and lots of great stuff. So lots of options. Have
So many
fun,
places to
experiment.
start. Yes.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a perfect ending and lots of great things for you to go experiment with and maybe kind of look into in your own practice and
Mm.
evaluate how it affects not just right after the practice, but if you're repeating some of these practices, how it affects your whole cycle.
Mm.
And then over time, after doing it for a few cycles, especially how it affects your cycle, and to do a little research, be the scientist.
Love it.
So check it out. We'll also leave a link to the female health training for
Mhm.
teachers who are interested and want more detailed, very detailed information on individualizing these supports for the different phases of the cycle. And I hope it's helpful.
Love it.
Thanks,
Thank you
Rachel.
so much, Tiffany.
Nice chat. Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.